All right. Thank you. All right, so good evening and welcome to the virtual literacy series offered by the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, Department of Theory and Practice in Teacher Education. I'm Dr. Sherry Meebell. I'm a professor in special education with an area of expertise in reading disabilities. Tonight's topic is demystifying dyslexia, addressing reality, assumptions, and myth. And welcome. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the puzzle that's called dyslexia. In 1877, as far as we know, the term was first coined by a German ophthalmologist named Rudolf Berlin. He observed adults who had difficulty reading with no apparent visual problems, and he concluded that the difficulty was brain-based. A little bit later, around that same time, three British medical professionals were also looking into dyslexia, what they termed word blindness in children. And Pringle Morton, this is actually a journal article that was written. He described dyslexia as a case study. A boy named Percy F., a well-grown lad, age 14, the eldest son of intelligent parents, the second child of a family of 7. He has always been a bright and intelligent boy, quick at games, and in no way inferior to others of his age. His great difficulty has been, and is now, his inability to learn to read. This inability is so remarkable and so pronounced that I have no doubt it is due to some congenital defect. So in the short little few sentences, Dr. Morton described, provided a good picture of what dyslexia really looks like in a young adolescent boy. In the early to mid-1900s, Samuel Orton, he was a neuropathologist in the United States, started to speculate on the role of cognitive development that plays in dyslexia. And with an educator, Anna Gillingham, he was among the first to advocate systematic phonics instruction. There's now an approach to instruction called Orton-Gillingham, which is a structured, systematic, and explicit approach to reading instruction based on their work. So let's talk a little bit about the myths associated with dyslexia. Some people believe dyslexia is a visual problem because people will be reading, people with dyslexia, and they'll misread words. Sometimes they do reverse words like saw and was. But dyslexia is not a visual problem, as we'll talk about a little later. Also, there's a lot of a belief that boys exhibit dyslexia more than girls. And in fact, it is the case that boys tend to be identified with dyslexia more. That's true with most disabilities. Boys get identified more, but genetic studies and brain studies are showing that it's actually more equal incidence in boys and girls. There's some under thought now that dyslexia can be identified by brain scans. That's not true, but we'll learn about brain imaging and what it has taught us about dyslexia so far. Individuals with dyslexia are lazy. Not true. Individuals with dyslexia are not smart. Again, not true, as we'll see in a little while. And only English-speaking people can have dyslexia. That is also not true. Now, here are some things that are more of assumptions, things that people think about dyslexia. Are they true or false? We'll learn a little bit more about these as we go along. So, writing letters and words backwards are characteristic of dyslexia. Is that true or false? Spending more time reading with children is an effective intervention for dyslexia. True or false? This is advice that pediatricians often give parents and teachers often give parents. Just read with them more. Does that, in fact, improve a child with significant reading difficulties called dyslexia? There's some popular press out there saying that dyslexia is a gift. There's a person named Ronald Davis who talks about that. Is dyslexia a gift? People can outgrow dyslexia. Is that true? And dyslexia is hereditary. Is that true? Some of these things are true, some of them are sort of true, and some of them are just kind of false. So we'll look at that. Not to perpetuate the reversal stereotype, here's a little humor for you. So let's get real. Let's talk about what is true about dyslexia. The teacher was telling the boy, it's called reading. It's how people install new software into their brains. That's a pretty good lay definition of what reading is. Reading is a very intricate learning process. John Steinbeck described it as a very tortuous process. And we do it when, start doing it when children are 5 years old. So why do we read? Reading is making meaning from print. That's why we read, to get meaning, to understand how to cook something, to understand how to put something together, to enjoy a piece of poetry, or to learn about weather or politics. For some kids, though, reading is very difficult. A quote from a book by a well-known researcher in dyslexia, Marianne Wolf. A child said, "I would rather clean mold from the bathtub than read." This is a little child, I think a first grader. So to understand dyslexia, we have to understand reading, a little more about reading. And a commonly used model of reading is called the simple view of reading. And it's based on the idea that the goal of reading is reading comprehension. And reading comprehension is determined by 2 things: how well the reader decodes the words, multiplied times their linguistic comprehension, their understanding of language and vocabulary. So things associated with decoding in this model are being able to understand, make sense of the sound symbol, the sound letter or letters, relationships. And those are, we talk about those as phonological skills and orthographic skills, and fluent reading, reading accurately, quickly, efficiently. Those are decoding skills in this model. Vocabulary, understanding text, and a deep understanding of word meanings, those comprise linguistic comprehension or listening comprehension. Takes both of those things. Without either of those things, we don't have reading. We don't have reading comprehension. But learning to read is acquired. It's not really a natural act as language is. Oral language development is distinctly human, and it's been part of being human for many millions of years. However, we've only had written language for only about 5,000 years. Reading has to be learned. It's a human invention. And so for some people, reading is difficult. Learning to read is difficult. Others not so much. But language develops naturally, reading doesn't. And then there's the additional challenge that learning to read in English is more challenging than some languages, because English orthography, or how our language is written, is not transparent. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between a sound and a letter in English. And there's lots of exceptions to the rules in English. All right, so here's a couple of fun examples of that. I take it you already know of touch and bow and cough and dough. Others may stumble, but not you, on hiccup, thorough, slough, and through. Well done, and now you wish perhaps to learn of less familiar traps. Beware of herd, a dreadful word that looks like beard and sounds like bird. No wonder kids have trouble learning to read and spell some words. There's another one. And dead, it's said like bed, not feed. For goodness sake, don't call it deed. Watch out for meat and great and threat. They rhyme with sweet and straight and dead. A moth is not a moth in mother, nor both in bother, broth in brother. Okay, I'm gonna quit there. Here's another one for fun. dose and rose and lose. So English, some say it's a dreadful language. Why, man alive, I'd learned to talk it when I was 5, and yet to read it, the more I tried, I hadn't learned it at 55. So English is a complex language. It's derived from several other languages. The letters weren't really developed to represent English. And then on top of that, some people especially struggle, people who have what we call dyslexia. Prevalence rates of dyslexia range from 5 to 20%. Maybe 5 to 10 is the best estimate. It really depends on severity and just sort of where we're going to draw that line. Jackie Stewart was a Scottish race car driver. He won 27 Grand Prix titles, and he was knighted by Prince Charles. He gave a speech to the British Dyslexia Association in 2001. You'll never understand what it feels like to be dyslexic. No matter how long you've worked in this area, no matter if your own children are dyslexic, you will never understand what it feels like to be humiliated your entire childhood and taught every day to believe that you will never succeed at anything. Stewart said that if he had failed to discover he could race cars successfully, he would have probably been in jail or worse. And in fact, in our prison systems, individuals with dyslexia are overrepresented significantly compared to the general population. There are significant consequences of not learning to read. So what is dyslexia and what's it not? It comes from a Greek word, Greek words dys and lexia, difficulty and language. It's a reading disorder or disability. In schools, public schools, K-12, Individuals with Disability Education Act uses the term reading disability. In the American Psychiatric Association uses the word disorder, but they're the same, they're referring to the same thing. It's a word reading problem at its core. It's neurological in basis, but not the same as an intellectual disability. It's not lack of intelligence nor motivation or lack of instruction or exposure. And it's not a visual problem, although it may or may not involve reversals in reading or writing. It sometimes does. So that's one of the assumptions or myths. No, not necessarily. Reversals may be there, but not necessarily. Again, it's not a visual problem. It involves poor basic reading skills, stronger comprehension. Think about that model of reading that we talked about earlier. Average or better intelligence, incidence 5 to 20%. Now, individuals with dyslexia may have difficulty with rhyming, and this is a common thing with young children if they have difficulty understanding the concept of rhyming. That may signify that they're going to have difficulties associated with dyslexia. A difficulty associating sounds and letters, confusion with names and sounds of letters that look alike, and then slow and disfluent reading, choppy, having to stop and go back, that kind of thing. We talked about the model of reading. This is a hypothesis related to dyslexia. The most common indicator of dyslexia is phonological skill. Phonological meaning sounds. Difficulty with sounds and understanding how those sounds are represented in words. But there's often difficulty also with rapid automatic naming or processing speed. When children have both of these, or when individuals have both of these, it's called the double deficit hypothesis, and that's when dyslexia has its most significant impact. So there are some people who doubt dyslexia or who deny it, but there's a growing consensus on the definition, and here are some of the characteristics. Neurobiological disorder, it affects the development of basic reading skills, spelling, automaticity with connecting sounds and symbols. It's often accompanied by specific weaknesses and cognitive factors that predict poor reading and spelling. It's lifelong, but effective interventions reduce the impact. And many other abilities are often intact and can even be advanced. In the American Psychiatric Association, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's called a specific learning disorder with an impairment in reading. And it mentions these three areas: word reading accuracy, reading rate or fluency, and reading comprehension. And dyslexia is typically the pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, decoding, and spelling. However, if you can't do those things, it blocks the path to comprehension. So comprehension, reading comprehension may also be compromised. The most commonly used definition in the United States is the one by the International Dyslexia Association. And I highlighted a few of the important words: neurobiological in origin, difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition, for spelling and decoding. I think if I had 1 minute to tell you if someone had dyslexia, I'd probably look at their spelling, actually, especially if they're a little bit older. There's usually a phonological component, unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. This is a very important characteristic of dyslexia. It is not global reading problems. It's not global intellectual problems. It's like the little boy Percy that was described, the adolescent boy. It was unexpected for him to have these difficulties based on his vocabulary and his other abilities. Obviously, those secondary problems can occur with reading comprehension. And here's the really kicker with dyslexia: reduced reading experience. So if you don't read well, then you don't read. And even if you try to read, you're going to read less than your peers. So you're going to have reduced reading experience, which will inhibit vocabulary growth over time and learning things. We learn things incidentally when we read. This is what Stanovich called the Matthew effect, that the poor get poorer. They don't read, and their reading actually slides further behind their peers, their reading and their vocabulary. Now, some well-known researchers in the area of dyslexia are Sally and Bennett Shaywitz. They're medical doctors at Yale. And they talk about dyslexia again, as they really emphasize the unexpected difficulty in reading related to the intelligence of the reader. And they talk about the significance of the phonological processing, which they define as the appreciation of individual sounds of spoken language. And it affects the ability to speak, read, spell, and often learn a second language, which is important to know as educators, because sometimes individuals with dyslexia, bright folks, they'll make it to college, and then they will need two things to succeed: extended time accommodations, and oftentimes either a modified approach to learning a foreign language, or maybe just avoiding that as a requirement if they can. The Shaywitz also, I really like this, this quote from Sally Shaywitz. It came from her book 2003, Overcoming Dyslexia, which has been revised to a 2020 version. She refers to dyslexia as a weakness in a sea of strengths. And the weaknesses are in decoding, but strengths may be in critical thinking, vocabulary, problem solving, empathy, general knowledge, comprehension, concept formation, and reasoning. And I will say anecdotally that in my experience assessing and working with many individuals with dyslexia over the years, I tend to see strengths in reasoning and forming concepts. Mathematical reasoning is often pretty strong in problem solving. Not always, but often see that pattern. Now, does this mean dyslexia is a gift? Probably wouldn't go that far. I won't read this whole definition, but in the Netherlands, there's a lot of research going on in the Netherlands related to dyslexia. And some of these researchers have written about the importance of automation of word identification and spelling. And automaticity is the ability to perform tasks without actively thinking through them. It's rapid automatic naming. And that's related also to the concept of processing speed. Those are related concepts that have to do with how quickly and accurately someone can read. So if you work with children who are struggling, sometimes they can learn to sound out words, but they're doing it very laboriously, very slowly. And they also sometimes are trying to apply these rules that they've learned to words that don't, that they haven't discerned, that they cannot be decoded. And so that has to do with the automaticity. Oh, there's a word that doesn't follow the rule. What's that word? Quickly recalling it, in fractions of a second. Some kids have a lot of problems with that. So some of the cognitive predictors of dyslexia are difficulty with phonological processing, which again is understanding and being able to manipulate sounds and do things like rhyming and segmenting different sounds in words, blending sounds in words, being able to delete sounds in words. Phonological processing does not actually involve reading, but it's important because it heavily influences how well a child can learn phonics, which is associating sounds with appropriate symbols. And then rapid automatic naming, processing speed, and working memory. These are all often implicated in dyslexia. Dyslexia also often co-occurs with other things. For example, I don't have the instance up here, but one thing it will co-occur with, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, is speech articulation problems when children are little. They have difficulty producing sounds. It kind of would stand to reason that they would have later some difficulties with being able to accurately and quickly, hear and associate those sounds. It's not an acuity problem, but more of a processing problem. But it's particularly coexists with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And if you think about it, this makes sense too, because kids who have attention problems tend to have memory problems. They tend not to get things in short-term memory, then they don't get in long-term memory. And they have difficulty with retrieval, automatic retrieval, automaticity. Here's one of our kids who probably was identified with ADHD. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the brain bases of dyslexia. There have been a lot of studies, functional magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, but they're functional MRIs. So the individuals are doing actual reading tasks while in the MRI. And over time, these brain imaging studies show that individuals with dyslexia exhibit differences in brain functioning when reading as compared to typically reading peers. And specifically, there's a disruption or there's decreases in metabolic activity in the posterior part of the left hemisphere. This is where the visual word forming area. And this area is associated with skilled and fluent reading and an overactivation of the left and right anterior systems where the right visual word forming. So it makes sense that the areas of the brain, there's irregularities in the areas of the brain where words are formed. And so the Shawitzes, and they've done a lot of these early MRI studies, they call this the neural signature of dyslexia. So there's both underactivity and overactivity in parts of the brain that are related to reading. And so individuals with dyslexia tend to show less activity in the areas of the brain associated with efficient reading, and then like the superfluous activity in areas of the brain that are less associated with fluent reading. Now, we'll talk a little bit about some subtypes of dyslexia. We talked earlier about two main areas of difficulty, phonological skills and processing speed or rapid automatic naming. So you see here that some studies have shown that in individuals identified with dyslexia, about 25% of them tend to just have difficulty with phonemic means one sound, or phonological skills. 20% tend to have just more of the automatic rapid naming, processing speed, fluency difficulty. And then 45% have both. That's the double deficit. And then another 10% show some of these, but with some memory difficulties as well. So dyslexia does have some somewhat distinct subtypes, but it also exists on a continuum from milder to severe, and in part that will depend on intervention, the types of instruction that that the person has participated in. The dyslexia has been really this Newsweek cover is from about the late 90s, and then a few years later it was on the cover of Time. I actually was interviewed in Ed Week last year. It's been a hot topic in Education Week. It's been a hot topic, a feature on National Public Radio last year. And yet, there's some resistance to using the term dyslexia. Two well-known researchers in the area of dyslexia said in 2013, we don't understand why the term dyslexia is often viewed as if it were a four-letter word, not to be uttered in polite company. Some people argue, and some of our well-meaning colleagues will argue, well, but why do you want to label someone? Labels aren't, we should put labels on jars, not people. But labels provide a way of talking about a problem. And it's my experience that individuals with dyslexia really do benefit from understanding their learning pattern, why they're struggling, why are they having difficulty with things that seem so easy for their peers. And I'm sure that you've probably heard the stories about famous people with dyslexia and how they've succeeded. Steven Spielberg, Agatha Christie are featured here. Others that you may know about. And there do seem to be some tendencies for at least some individuals with dyslexia to think really creatively, to think in ways that aren't necessarily linear, which kind of make for a good reader, but which may be correlated with creativity. So there are some people with dyslexia. Henry Winkler, who played the Fonz back in, just lost the name of the show. He played a well-known character, and Henry Winkler talked about how he had to, just really memorize the lines because he really couldn't read them. And he's written a series of books about a kid with dyslexia named Hank. Happy Days, sorry, that's the name of the show, Happy Days. It escaped my mind for a moment. Let's take a look at Ethan. Ethan is a fifth grader. Look at how he's writing, look at how he's spelling his words. You see that it's interesting because he's learned some orthography in the first word. He has the word P and people, right? You put two words together, spell those words correctly, but he doesn't know the orthography of the word people. In the word any, he mistook the vowel. And you can see going down through here the types of errors. So he is definitely not automatized the patterns of letters that make these words, which by his age and grade he should have more mastery of. Here's another sample of some what are called sight words. So these are words that aren't typically decoded, and you can see how this child spelled some of these words. Here's the writing of a 9-year-old, Charlie. Desert Base Camp. When we got there, they told me I was part of a team called the Black Ops Special Government Organization. He's got some pretty sophisticated thoughts. Do you see now he does have reversal in his writing in a couple places. camp. He's spelled in a pretty unusual way. He's got the P sound. He has the wrong vowel in the word was. So these are examples of kids with pretty significant dyslexia, and it shows up in their spelling. And dyslexia doesn't really go away, but it can be, through intervention, it can be significantly addressed and improved. So who can identify dyslexia? Dyslexia can be identified, it depends, by qualified psychologists, speech language pathologists, perhaps, educational diagnosticians, perhaps special educators. It depends. The person needs to have appropriate training and expertise. Not all psychologists know how to diagnose dyslexia or identify dyslexia. Certainly not all of the people in any of these groups know how. There's a couple of sources available. Here at UT, we have a center in our sister department, Educational Psychology and Counseling, called the Class Center, that has school psychologists and school psychologists in training, and they do provide assessment of dyslexia. In addition, a good resource is the International Dyslexia Association. The Tennessee branch of that actually lists qualified individuals in the area to provide assessment. In schools, school psychologists are able to provide an assessment of reading disability, but there is some reluctance to specifically use the term dyslexia. Instead, they are identifying characteristics of dyslexia. So in identifying dyslexia, obviously, looking at reading and writing skills are critical. But in addition, a thorough assessment to fully identify will include assessments of phonological awareness, processing speed, rapid automatic naming, working memory, and other cognitive skills. The idea is to get at what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses. Oftentimes an individual with dyslexia will have strengths in oral language, oral vocabulary, and reasoning, and the weaknesses will be in different types of decoding, spelling, and quickly and automatically recognizing words. So a thorough assessment needs to identify these different areas. So what's happening across this country is quite interesting. Over the past, I think, 6 to 8 years, we've seen passage of dyslexia laws in most of the states. And a lot of this is attributed to a group called Decoding Dyslexia, which is a grassroots group which has branches in almost every state. And it's really mostly parents, mostly moms, who were motivated because they didn't believe that their children were being identified and receiving appropriate instruction. What's interesting is that the laws vary from state to state. So some of them require only screening for dyslexia, some require, spell out the type of instruction required, some spell out what the institutions of higher ed, the ed prep providers have to do. The laws vary pretty significantly from state to state. In Tennessee, we are required to address dyslexia in our coursework, and schools are required to screen for dyslexia and provide appropriate interventions for individuals with characteristics of dyslexia. Those individuals may or may not be in special education, depending on the severity. They may receive instruction in Tier 2 or Tier 3 in the response intervention model and not necessarily in special education. So the parents that united and formed Decoding Dyslexia They want accurate identification and instruction for their children. And it's what we all want. So what is it? So dyslexia is characterized by these difficulties with phonological skills and automaticity, fluency. So what type of instruction is appropriate for individuals with dyslexia? What's different about it? The International Dyslexia Association, within the last 3 years or so, has described an approach called structured literacy. And it's not a specific program, it's not a program that they sell, but it is a set of characteristics that define certain programs or certain approaches and not others. And so structured literacy is characterized by systematic, explicit instruction, integrating listening, speaking, reading, and writing that emphasizes the structure of language across the speech sound system, writing system, and the structure of sentences, meaningful parts of words, relationships among words, and organization of spoken and written discourse. So structured literacy is what it says. It's structured, systematic, explicit, follows a sequence, and children achieve mastery really before they move on to other aspects of instruction. And the International Dyslexia Association has documents related to structural literacy and more information about what comprises structural literacy. There are some approaches used in schools. This list is a little bit old. I'm sure there are some newer ones, but the idea with instruction is that it needs to have a strong basis in foundational skills, or what we might call code-based, emphasizing that children need to learn the code of the language in order to comprehend. Knox County uses a self-developed approach called CARE. Corrective reading is an approach for older children. Language and Language X by Surface West. Reading Mastery used to be called DISTAR many years ago. Slinger and Spalding, and variations of Wilson. These are just some of those available. There's another one called, Linda Bell is on here as well, Linda Bell. The essence of these is they introduce letter-sound correspondence systematically, teaching students to blend and sound words and segment words to read and spell, with scaffolded instruction, modeling guidance, positive corrective feedback, and opportunities for practice and review using games, constructing sentences, and practice reading. Explicit approaches include such things as, they do include word study, but it's in a systematic approach. They use onset rhymes, which are, they'll teach onset rhymes, which are essentially small parts of words, common parts of words, such as AT or UP, and add the initial onsets, the initial consonants or consonant blends to make words. And they do teach word families as well. So it's not all just blending and synthetic phonics, although that is a part of it, but it is a comprehensive approach to explicitly teaching children to decode and recognize words quickly and efficiently. Using appropriate interventions, children with dyslexia can grow up to be very successful. And again, here's a list of some famous people who supposedly had dyslexia. My email is sfl1@utk.edu if you have any questions you would like to ask me. And I am going to stop now for questions.